Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. My guest today is Professor Kristin Henning of Georgetown University Law Center, where she directs the university's Juvenile Justice Clinic. She's the author of the book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, available from Pantheon Books. Professor Henning, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So I think that there has been a lot of national attention paid to the shootings of young Black men and women by police in the United States. And when there are fatal shootings like that of Tamir Rice, for example, they do get national news coverage. And you write about those cases in your book. But you also draw our attention to the fact that separate from the cases of deadly violence by police, there is a whole everyday regime of surveillance and violence that young Black men, boys and girls grow up in. And so I wonder if we could start with you just sort of laying out in general terms the territory here in terms of what the things that, you know, we talk about the shootings, but what are the other aspects of life for for Black youth that you really want to draw attention to by writing and publishing this book?
Yes. Thank you so much for that question, because it so often gets missed in the hubbub of the conversation of extreme examples of violence. But in a city like Washington, D.C., and it's not just D.C., it's throughout the country, there are pockets of communities where Black and brown children have grown up under the constant surveillance of police officers. So I talk about, for example, my clients who share stories of literally coming outside of their homes and seeing police officers parked on a street corner, parked in the nearby recreation center. They encounter police officers when they enter a convenience store. They might encounter them on the way out. Police officers stop them and ask them, "Where are you going? Where are you coming from?" They get asked, "Can you lift your shirt?" The police officer will ask a young person, "Can you lift your shirt so that I can see your waistband and be sure that you are not carrying a weapon?" And I think most of us take it for granted that we can walk through our neighborhoods and our communities and not have or not experience sort of these undue intrusions by law enforcement. But so many Black and brown children don't enjoy that basic privilege. And it's really traumatic. I mean,
I was going to ask, what does it do to a child to be raised and to go through life every day encountering police officers routinely? And I mean, I assume it creates a sort of constant state of fear and anxiety at a kind of low level.
Absolutely. So you've nailed it. There is now a growing body of empirical research that documents the extraordinary psychological trauma that policing imposes on Black children at the most important time in their lives, their adolescent development years. And that research shows that Black children, and many of the studies have been associated with Latino children as well, but that children who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods and who are the frequent targets of stop and frisk have high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hyper vigilant, meaning that they're always on guard and distrusting police officers. And what's really significant is that distrust transfers over to other adult authority figures, like teachers at times, right? And then the research goes on to show us that young people in these communities also report great disruption in their sleep patterns, right? Something that we sort of take for granted, but that, young people who have been the frequent target of stop and frisk report really poor sleep quality or not being able to sleep at all. Another really critical, answer to this question about what does it do to them, it has a profound impact on adolescent identity formation, which is one of the most important things that happens in our adolescent years. So negative encounters with the police have an impact on the way young people see themselves, feel about themselves, and how they think they fit into the world and in relationship with other people. And then the final thing that I think is really important for all of us who care about public safety is that early negative encounters with the police, we should, know this intuitively, but these early negative encounters have a profound impact on the ways in which young people think about law and think about law enforcement and whether or not law enforcement is legitimate and fair, right? Whether it's even worth it to participate in mainstream society based upon how they are treated.
Yeah, I think there's one point that is worth emphasizing that is often missed, which is that for every incident of the police doing something to someone that has ramifications beyond even its consequences for the person who is targeted by the incident. It's like with the history of lynching, the number of lynchings was very high, but also the ramifications of each instance of that kind of horrific violent punishment are that every single other person is on notice and has to live in constant fear. So even the youth who are not in fact stopped or frisked are affected by the fact that at any time they could be stopped or frisked.
Absolutely. And I write about that quite a bit. I mean, just having to get up in the morning and worrying about whether or not you will be the next target of some sort of police violence is significant. And when I talk to police officers, I say to them, like, you have to remember that the blue uniform carries with it the history of race relations in America. And so that even when you approach a young person with the best of intentions, even in a wellness check, you have to understand that that Black child has now watched on the television, on internet, other examples of police violence. In the same way, people experience PTSD from watching on television the Twin Towers collapse, the Boston bombing, Boston Marathon bombing, and watching people stranded on bridges after Hurricane Katrina. These examples and evidence of PTSD throughout the community were evident. That research is now being replicated in light of what people are seeing police do on television. And one thing that I'll say in response to your question is that, in the era of lynching, that was very much intentional. Right. So the lynching of Emmett Till was absolutely a symbolic statement in the heart of the civil rights era after Brown versus Board of Education that we will not tolerate, integration. And so it became, as you said, a symbol, putting everyone on notice to stay in their places. And now I think much of the police violence it operates in the same way, even if it's not intentionally laid out and methodically planned in that way, that the biases that we as a society and the fears that we have of Black children that are just not founded, really are not founded, even in the face of temporary upticks in violent crime. The data does not support this notion that Black children collectively are a terror in society. But it is those types of bias that lead to the shootings that indeed set the stage and frightened all Black children into some sort of submission, and cabin them and limit opportunities and lead to death.
And every day those children have to live knowing that the burden of proof is on them to show that they're not a danger. If they don't want to be asked to lift their shirt, if they don't want to have a gun pointed at them, they have to monitor all of their behaviors to try and not give any tip-offs or signs to authority figures that are going to lead to an incident. So they're constantly, that must occupy just an enormous portion of a child's, brain power, daily energy going through the day, thinking, how am I going to get through the day? How am I going to avoid an unpleasant confrontation?
And think about how incredibly hard it is to do for an adult, right? So you just articulated what the sort of survival mechanism is, for a Black person trying to navigate, policing in America, or perceptions even of policing in America, and how much of the psychological space it occupies. But what do we know about adolescents? Adolescents are impulsive, they're reactive, they're emotional, they're fairness fanatics. They lack often the language to articulate to a police officer, Mr. Officer, I comply, anything that we expect adults to do is that much harder for a teenager, for an adolescent whose brain is still developing. So it's a tall order. And so what we find is sometimes, Black children who have been told by their parents, who've been given the talk,
right.
Do whatever, right? Parents tell their children, do whatever you have to do to get home safe. Just do what the officer tells you to do. And, a Black child, to the best of their ability, will try to do so. But that moment of impulsivity, that moment, kicks in. And they act like any teenager of any race would act in that moment. And I got to tell you, the title of my book is The Rage of Innocence, right? And in part, at a macro level, the rage of innocence is that rage that any of us should have, or all of us should have, when any one child is deprived of an opportunity to be a child. But here's the deal. The rage of innocence also refers to the rage that Black children have when they're told over and over again that they're bad and that they're criminal and they're not worthy and that they should be excluded from society. And any self-respecting human being with an ounce of dignity is going to resist those labels. And so they might speak out and they might push back. And they're not going to be able to do it like you and me. They're not going to say, Mr. Officer, I don't appreciate the way you've talked to me. And instead, right? It's not happening. It's not happening. Your child isn't doing that, right? And instead,
excuse me, sir, I object to my treatment.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, kids are kids. This is one of the important things that comes out in your book, is that, we need every child deserves to get to be a child.
Yes.
And that even includes some level of sympathy for misbehavior or acting out. Yes. Or, I mean, you begin the book with this story of your client, Eric, who tried to make a Molotov cocktail, right? But in the way that kids who've only seen something on television have no idea what it is try to make. And then the reaction of the system to that, as if he was actually some kind of terrorist threat to the school, instead of going like, oh my God, Eric tried to make a Molotov cocktail because he saw it on TV, because that's like how kids are kids. They do silly things, and it's part of you have to have some kind of indulgence. And I know I got plenty of indulgence as a child.
Right. Exactly. And in this book, I really try so hard to tell stories that will allow the reader to see themselves, just as you just said, to see themselves as a child, or to see their own children in these stories doing what children do. And I gotta say that this notion of not giving grace and indulgence for children to be children really has a racial overlay, right? Because as you point out, I tell the story about Eric making this Molotov cocktail, or attempting to make a Molotov cocktail. Why? Without researching at all. He's not getting on the internet, but he's literally throwing liquids in a bottle, mind you, liquids that he chose that would not be flammable, right? And so he then literally he puts the bottle in his book bag and he forgets all about it. This was on a Saturday night. Monday, he goes to school, puts his book bag through the metal detector, and a school resource officer finds it and says, "What is this?" He immediately says to them, "Oh, that's nothing. You can throw it away." And he doesn't think anything of it. Next thing he knows, he gets arrested. The fire department comes and they haul him off to court where he has a 9-month ordeal. But here's the racial overlay, right? And this is really part of why I wanted to write this book. I'm giving a lecture. I go off and I'm giving a talk in Connecticut sometime later, and I share Eric's story with the audience. And a white woman comes up to me after, and she says, "My son did the exact same thing." And I said to her, "Well, what happened?" And she says he got placed in advanced chemistry classes, accelerated classes, and that's what we do. I mean, this was a kid, he was 13 years old, playing.
Well, and I mean, you even just said casually, he had to put his book bag through the metal detector, which I never had to put my book bag through a metal detector. Never once. That never happened, right? So, I mean, that's another thing where it's the presumption against young people, right? Every young person is suspect. They have the burden of proof to prove that they are not bringing some kind of weapon into school to hurt people, rather than us just assuming that these are children. They are almost certainly not doing that because they're children.
Right. And the data shows again that school resource officers are disproportionately present in schools that have a high percentage of Black and brown children. And what was so fascinating about doing some of the research on the presence of police in schools is that I bought into the long repeated narrative that we have police in schools because of the mass shootings that took place in the 90s, like Columbine. And one thing that I learned in the research historically was that actually the first police officers in schools, as we know, appeared back in 1939 in Indianapolis with the earliest conversations about integration. And then the school police presence increased dramatically in the civil rights era when police officers were sent under the purported mission of facilitating integration. And we know through iconic pictures all across the country and through the research that we have that many police went to those schools to impede those integration efforts. And here's what's significant. The National Association of School Resource Officers was actually founded in 1991. That is 8 years before Columbine, that mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado. The NASRO, the National Association of School Resource Officers, really grew up in response to that temporary uptick in crime in the 1990s that led to the super predator myth. Right? This pseudo-scientific myth or prediction that Black children were going to run amok and maim, kill, and rape, all the people. None of that turned out to be true, right? Temporary uptick in crime, and none of that turned out to be true. Crime plummeted, but yet Black children became the primary targets of police surveillance and the like. Following the 1990s. And so now we have schools, right, that have been funded by, have received federal funding to increase their presence of school resource officers. And guess where the police officers go? They don't go to the suburbs, right, like Columbine, where, many wealthy white youth or middle-class youth appear, but instead they get sent to predominantly Black and brown schools.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure because you've dealt with so many children over the course of your career as a defense attorney and leading the Juvenile Justice Clinic, you must find that it really turns kids off school for school to resemble a prison so much, to be full of essentially guards, right? To have, you go through the metal detector to get there, to build this kind of institution where the authority figures dehumanize you has got to have an effect in making children less likely to be interested in whatever that school has to teach them.
Absolutely. And there's actually, again, been research. There's both, every time, virtually every question, every theme has both stories that we can tell as well as research, empirical research to back it up. And it's absolutely right. Our young people talk about, I don't want to go to school. I don't want to be harassed every time I walk through the front door, and especially young people with disabilities, right? Are really Black and brown children with disabilities experience the brunt of use of force by police officers. So there's just sort of case after case, and particularly lately, we see of school resource officers body slamming a child in school or arresting a child in school for normal adolescent behaviors. And I want to be really clear. This is, not all police officers by any stretch of the imagination. Many police officers ask to be assigned to school because they care about children. But what we're talking about is the word you use, the extension of policing from the community into the schoolhouse and creating a school climate that is indeed dehumanizing, that makes young people feel like they are always being critiqued and not welcome. And school is the one place that children are allowed to go and feel safe, or supposed to go and feel safe.
Yeah.
And they don't feel physically safe. They don't feel psychologically safe. The empirical research shows that in schools where there's a heavy police presence, that the related stress that arises from that reduces academic performance. It increases school discipline beyond what is traditional and normal as a response to adolescent behavior. Therefore, teachers, it becomes easier to rely on police officers in schools to handle routine matters of school discipline, right? So, yeah, you see children getting arrested and the like.
I think it's also worth noting that a lot of the disciplinary procedures that we have further impede students' abilities to learn. I always found it weird that if you misbehaved in school, you got suspended from school, right? You thought, okay, well, that can't possibly help at all. Right. And when it's more extreme, when it's arresting kids and thrusting them into essentially the bureaucratic machine of the juvenile justice system, which takes a ton of time, a ton of energy, which introduces this whole new procedure that is about to occupy your life. I mean, it just makes it harder and harder for a child to have the time and focus on the thing that supposedly we want them to do, which is why, in this white parent whose kid made the Molotov cocktail, which is why the sensible reaction when the kid does the Molotov cocktail thing is to go, okay, well, we're going to use this as an opportunity to have you focus on chemistry, right? Because what we want the child to do is at school is to learn chemistry. So how can we take this and channel it into something that is going to make them better at school rather than do something that is going to actually make it even harder for them to be engaged?
Absolutely. It's so true. I mean, our responses are counterintuitive and more harmful than helpful. And we see this sort of over and over again, and particularly during adolescence. I mean, the absolute worst thing you want to do during adolescence is stifle creativity. The brain is the most malleable, and positive reinforcement, positive supports, rehabilitative strategies, corrective engagement, ways of redirecting young people towards positive activities is the most effective during adolescence. So instead, though, what we're doing is we send them to juvenile detention facilities and even juvenile prisons where It's the opposite of creativity. In fact, it's regimented, routine activities that more than anything, that actually just reinforce negative behaviors among young people. So it is truly the worst thing that we can do. And we need to keep kids in school. The more you suspend a child, discipline a child, the more likely they're going to drop out of school altogether and never go back, right? And so they never become productive citizens, both in terms of, from the economic sense, but in terms of the law-abiding sense. So we're not doing ourselves any favors either in terms of public safety.
Yeah. When I was growing up in Florida, I worked at the local teen court in Sarasota, Florida, and I had a kind of revelation, that it was a good experience that made me want to be a lawyer, because I saw that we had, most of the cases in the teen court were, because it was a diversionary program, and they were bringing in like 16 to 17-year-old, white kids who'd smoke pot, and they got to do the diversionary program, and they got to do this volunteer thing. But then when black children came in from the black school in the city, they were younger. They were like 10 years younger because they'd been arrested. And we had like a 9-year-old girl who'd been arrested because she threw a tantrum in class and like kicked her teacher. She kicked her teacher. Right. Okay, you shouldn't kick your teacher. Right. Definitely shouldn't kick your teacher. But this is something that was clearly in all of the other schools being dealt with administratively. Like if you kick your teacher, you go to the office and then you have to write a note to your teacher saying, "I'm sorry, I kicked you." But in this school, she's dragged away in handcuffs and then put into a court proceeding that is then going to occupy the next months of her life as a 9-year-old child. And it's like a 9-year-old child doesn't even understand what a court is. How could we possibly think that this is helping this child? And I take it, one of the things you're saying is that all around the country, this is the case, that, when a small black child commits an offense that in a white school would be dealt with in the normal, regular, sane way that you would deal with a child misbehaving, the handcuffs come out.
Absolutely. And it's just so sad. I mean, just listening to that story, I mean, it's just story after story all over the country. It's just so painful to contemplate, right? That you're going to take a 9-year-old out in handcuffs is just so appalling. And then there's so many pieces to that, right? Like one, your point about their being younger. It's true. The racial disparities in arrest are even greater the younger the child is, which is just amazing. So it's like the essence of childhood is lost earlier and earlier and earlier for Black children. And in fact, are sort of stating that same principle from the opposite lens. There is research showing that civilians and police officers often perceive Black children as older than they are. In fact, 4.5 years older than they are. Some really wonderful research by Dr. Philip Atiba Goff and some of his colleagues, right? And so think about like a Tamir Rice, for example, who was 12 at the time, is being looked at as if he's 16, 17 years old. But think about like a 16-year-old is being looked at like a 20, 21-year-old. It really has profound impacts. And then think about it, these young ages of 8 and 9 and how they're being perceived and treated. And then, I assume you know about the report from ProPublica about those children in Rutherford County, Tennessee, who were arrested, between the ages of 8 and 12 for a crime that did not even exist, where the police officers came into their school and took them out. And what was so tragic about that, when all the information came out, it turns out that these children were watching after school a pickup game of basketball. Right? And little bitty children. So, and then there's a little fight that breaks out. These children were watching the fight. They weren't in the fight. They were watching the fight. And so they got arrested for that. And it's just, again, little Black children, 8 years old, when they get arrested, crying hysterically out of fear and terror. I have 10-year-old, stories, in DC about a 10-year-old child who, gets placed in handcuffs and and soils his pants because he's so afraid. So that's just the young kids. We would never, ever think about, treating, white children, to be quite frank, in these ways.
And not only they're perceived as being older, they in fact sometimes are tried as adults, right? Even though they're children and thrust into adult facilities, which, I mean, we could get into all the true horrors of a child in prison, right? And what that does to a person. I wanted to ask you about, a lot of the discipline that is exacted, as I understand it, is not even is oftentimes discipline for disobedience or for not obeying the rules, rather than being calculated towards like actually wanting the children to do well at school. Another case that came to mind that I saw was when a kid, I think he'd been suspended from school, but he went back to school to his locker to get his homework, because he was like, while I was suspended, I want to do my homework. This is a young, like a black middle schooler, and arrested for trespassing, right? Because you were banned from the school, but he was like, well, I came back to get my homework from my locker. Now, normally, like a normal approach to that is to say, good. Glad you came back for your homework. So because, you could actually use your suspension to do schoolwork. But there's this real, and I think it's often true with police encounters too, where like the thing that the police detest most is any sign of defying police authority, which is punished incredibly harshly.
So right, I actually write a chapter called Contempt of Cop.
Oh, really, yes, right.
And it's a play on, it's literally a concept. I didn't, come up with it, but journalists have written about it, and they're able to document the offenses across the country for which police officers arrest, and especially young people, but it could be anyone, but arrest folks for disobedience or disregard of authority or showing disrespect to a police officer. And again, this really ties back to what we talked about earlier about adolescents, right? Adolescents are fairness fanatics. And so you've got a kid who gets stopped by the police. They believe they're stopped unfairly. And what do? They speak out. And the officer doesn't have any true, real crime to arrest them. There's no drugs, there's no gun, there's no assault. And so instead, they arrest them for these low-level offenses like disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, or in schools. There's even in some states a statute called disturbing schools. And folks across the country have been trying to advocate for those statutes to be removed, particularly as they relate to children. But it's using that. That's what the ways in which, Black and brown people are arrested for speaking out, for standing up for their rights, right? Mm-hmm. And it's similar to your story about sort of just any disobedience of the rule. I told you to sit down, so you must sit down. And you hear it all the time. People will say, and police officers will say, well, if you just obeyed, if you just did what I said, then I wouldn't have had to beat you with my baton, or I wouldn't have had to arrest you, without realizing the extraordinary psychological trauma that's associated with a false arrest or an illegal stop and frisk. We actually have rules in the country about when a police officer can stop you. And so any effort, as you say, by a Black child to speak out and say, but no, I actually don't have to do what you said, is treated as absolute contempt and can lead to force.
It's very difficult for a child to accept something perceived as unfair. As you say, the fanatic, right? We know the kids go, but that's not fair. That's not fair. And children will throw a tantrum if something's not fair. And it's actually, it's a rather lovely quality of children is that they have this very deep sense of justice. And if you can't offer them an explanation that is satisfactory as to why they're doing something, because I said so, makes a child angry. And that, shows children to be really quite precocious, reasoners, right? They want reasons for things. They want the world to make sense. They get frustrated and angry when the world doesn't make sense. Whereas as adults, we're so worn down that we just go, yeah, the world doesn't make sense. You just got to accept arbitrary impositions of authority over you, and you've just got to be quiet, and that's the way it is because you want to get along in the world. And that's kind of sad. There's this spark of rebellious fire in children that, you know, we should admire and we should love about them.
Absolutely.
Well, you must have seen a lot of. Oh, I think one thing I'd like to try and convey is you must, over the course of watching kids over a period of time, have seen a lot of really bright and wonderful and curious young people who just get beaten down by this system and who just lose that spark of joy and of life. I mean, Eric has a happy ending, actually. You say in the book, exactly. you give some hope, but you know, there are a number of just really tragic cases of wonderful kids who just subjected to this brutal system. Just you know, it's really got to destroy their souls.
Right. And we should recognize this phenomena is happening. I mean, we know enough now about children who are subject, for example, to parental abuse and neglect, and what happens to them when they're given limited opportunities. Now imagine an entire sort of society which is manifested by the policing and criminalization of Black children. And when I talk about policing, I should point out here that I'm not just talking about police in a blue uniform. I'm talking about all civilians who are afraid of Black children, right? And treat them with fear and rejection, and who call the police on a Black child. Over time, that does real damage to the psyche of a Black child, their sense of hope, their sense of what they can achieve, and whether they should participate in mainstream society. And we should not be surprised by that, right? You know, you can't beat, a dog until they're down and then expect them to get up. And children aren't dogs, right? And so you just can't expect them to give up. And so to get back up without some support. And so I do want to sort of at least offer, a word of hope for all the children, right? Which is that one of my psychologist friends said to me that every single child deserves one irrationally caring adult. And children do better with a team of irrationally caring adults. And that we can shift that tide by, one, as you said, I talk about in the book, treating children like children, and especially Black and brown children who have been disproportionately, adultified, for lack of better words. So that when children make mistakes, what it means to be an irrationally caring adult is to recognize that children will make mistakes. They will do things that we don't approve of, but we will still stand by them. We will offer them guidance. We will offer them redirection. And even when there's more serious offenses, when there's criminal behavior, we show the same grace and tolerance to Black children as we would to a white child. So that means mental health supports. That means vocational opportunities. That means taking advantage of what is evidence-based best practices for dealing with children who have been engaged in violence. There's programmatic frameworks for dealing with young people. There is evidence, there's strategies for teaching conflict resolution to young people. It's just there are ways in which we can treat children with grace and give them hope and give them and help them get to a place of resilience.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to conclude by asking you about the kind of the programmatic alternative to the dysfunction you see. But in many ways, it is kind of simple and straightforward, which is that once you begin from the premise that Black children have equal humanity and deserve the same things, and that if we think that, you cite some of the criming while white cases, right? If we think that a little child, a teenager like, even like Brock Turner or Kyle Rittenhouse, who had judges draw attention to the fact that they are teenagers, and teenagers are impulsive. I mean, it really is just a matter of applying the same set of standards equally, so that we recognize what a child is and what a child deserves, and that doesn't vary by race.
Yes, that's it. I mean, you nailed it. That's it. It's applying those principles that we now know. We now have more research on the adolescent brain and how it works and how to rehabilitate it, how to, to nurture it to its best place, from adolescence to adulthood than we ever have. And it is about applying those same principles to Black children as we would to white children. And I think, your examples are spot on. Kyle Rittenhouse, which is, the most recent example, which is such a quintessential example of adolescent, behavior, literally, tracking over state lines with a rifle attached, to his waist or to his, across his body, with minimal experience with handling a weapon, notwithstanding he had this hunting license, right? He's still a kid. He's got no level of expertise. That's why, this situation went so awry so quickly. It's irrational. It's not thoughtful. It's not, he's not thinking through what the consequences are. And what was clear and what really struck me about the Rittenhouse case is, the ways in which literally his mother almost pleaded with the public to see him, or pleaded with the officers to see him as a child, right? She was quite distraught when the police told her that her son would be tried as an adult, right? And, the ways in which, Kyle Rittenhouse, cried as if he, as a child, right? And so there was this sense that this was a teenager. And you're absolutely right. When we see Black children coming in on serious cases, and even without murder, even without, a death involved, they are absolutely, as you talked about earlier, transferred into adult court, not given the benefit and the grace, the second chance, not given the mental health supports and the like that young people need. So it really is just applying the same principles that we would apply to any adolescent who either who makes a mistake or who just does something very stupid, irrational, and not thought out.
Yeah, I mean, I know that a number of my sort of progressive comrades saw the Rittenhouse case and thought, well, throw the book at him, send that kid to prison he's a murderer. He went to a Black Lives Matter protest and killed two people, but there's a different reaction which says, okay, well, the real, I get being really angry at him and at that case, but we could take our anger in a different direction, which is to say, well, but why don't we ensure that everyone gets the kind of mercy that someone like Rittenhouse gets? I mean, he got a lot of understanding, and yes, that's deeply unfair because not everyone does get that level of understanding. But why don't we expand our circle of empathy and exclude the possibility of sending a minor to an adult prison for decades from the range of possible solutions to social harm?
Absolutely. And, not only empathy, but also due process. Let's, start there, right at the beginning. He got a fair trial or, again, so notice what I'm doing. I am taking race and politics out of the conversation about Rittenhouse for the moment, right? And truly, right, it is, due process as we envisioned it, an opportunity to confront the witnesses and the like. You think about Tamir Rice, who has a toy gun that he's playing with, not an assault rifle strapped around his body, and nobody gets killed. But Tamir Rice, within seconds, less than 3 seconds, is shot down. right? That's the difference. You know, Kyle Rittenhouse gets a due process, Tamir Rice gets killed. And that's the difference. And then forget empathy, you know, right? for you know, Tamir Rice on the back end. But you're absolutely right. Even when Kyle Rittenhouse, when it's clear he's the perpetrator, clear that he had a weapon with live ammo that can kill people and did kill people, he still gets mercy.
Well, Professor Kristin Henning, the book is The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth, available from Pantheon Books. Thank you so much for this fascinating and I think very important conversation.
Thank you for having me again. I appreciate your attention to this conversation.
All right, that was great. Thanks for listening, and I hope you will all consider subscribing to Current Affairs magazine. Our print edition is beautiful and comes out once every 2 months, and you can get that at currentaffairs.org/subscribe. And if you go to patreon.com/currentaffairs, you can also subscribe to our magnificent podcast. Thank you very much.